They have been the class of the Big 12 for the past 3 seasons, but without Baker Mayfield and some other NFL personnel, we'll see if Oklahoma can keep the top spot in their conference. We bring in Josh Cowan from the LGG. Please join him and the rest of the staff there as they cover Big 12 athletics and especially football. Josh, how you doing today?
Good, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So let's break down some OU football. And Kyler Murray is obviously the subject of the day, of the week, of the month. Uh, Most likely the Oklahoma starting quarterback who has some options in life, has signed as the ninth selection in the Major League Baseball draft just from last week. And Oklahoma allows that, and at the same time, Major League Baseball allowing him to play, or the Oakland A's, I should say, in particular, allowing him to play football at least this one season, and he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining, so it doesn't appear to be an issue right now, but obviously something that he's going to have to decide in the next year or so.
Yeah, and I mean, he seems from everything we've read, he's going to play football, and everyone inside the OU football program is under the impression that he's going to be there this year, and then he's going to go on to play baseball for the A's next year. And the A's seem okay with that. Lincoln Riley seems okay with that. So it's a pretty interesting situation. If I was offered $5 million to go play professional baseball, I'd probably be doing that tomorrow. But Kyler, he wants to do both. So good for him that he can do that.
Yeah, two things come to mind as soon as you mention that, and that's money, and that's injury factor, which is much less in baseball. And, of course, the money's right there for the taking right now. When we look at the quarterback situation, I guess we're assuming that he is the starting quarterback. I know sophomore Austin Kendall may have something to say about that in August. Do we have any indications based on what happened in the spring or anything that Lincoln Riley has talked about that would indicate that this is still a battle?
From comments that Riley, I think comments Riley has made, he's saying that it's still a battle. Everything that I've seen, that I've read, and when you watch the spring game, I think it's still probably Kyler Murray's job. Austin Kendall, though, I mean, Austin Kendall, he looked good in the spring game, and he could definitely, if Murray were to leave, I think he would be a very good quarterback for OU next year. But I think right now, what probably separates Kyler is that lethal athleticism that he has, that really high end speed that he brings to the game. Austin Kendall is a very good quarterback, but I don't know if he has necessarily like an X factor that Kyler does.
Based on what's happened here in the spring and coming off of last season and last season's losses in terms of personnel, your outlook for the Oklahoma offense, which obviously much is expected.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Oklahoma they're still going to have a lot of the best personnel in the conference. They'll probably still have the best offensive line, even though they lost Orlando Brown. They still have, I think, about 100 starts coming back along that offensive line, so they'll still probably be pretty good there. In terms of like the wide receivers and the running back, overall, a very good collection. I don't know if they necessarily have the best player in the conference. That's probably a debate at any of those positions, but definitely they still have a lot of talent at those positions, a lot of guys ready to step up. And like we just talked about, Kyler Murray, if he's assuming he's going to play for Oklahoma in the fall, he'll probably be one of the top quarterbacks in the conference as well.
All right, we're joined by Josh Cowan. You can join him and the rest of the staff at the LGG covering Big 12 football. And, of course, Oklahoma's king of the hill at this point after defeating TCU twice, including in the Big 12 championship game. Both teams will have new quarterbacks this season. And really, as you look across the conference, quarterback, even more so in this conference than any other, is position number one because of the style of play. And, of course, Will Grier is the one incumbent, at least out of the main contenders coming back. Oklahoma State has quite the battle with 3 or 4 guys going at it. Again, as we mentioned, Austin Kendall with something to say, but Kyler Murray appears to be the guy in line for the starting job at OU. So defensively, the team was average considering what the outcome of the season was, which they came within a play or two of making it all the way to the national championship game. But we're playing three teams or matched up potentially against three teams in the playoffs that had elite defenses. And Oklahoma is able to, because of the offensive firepower and because of the style of play in the conference. And some would argue on the Big 12 side that because they face high power offenses, you're not going to have the defensive statistics that you would in some other conferences. But how do we appear on that side of the football this year?
I think that's probably what's really interesting going into this season. I know that Mike Stoops, the defensive coordinator at OU, that there are some OU fans that maybe think it might be a time for a change there. But the outlook for next season, in the secondary for OU, they've got guys like Parnell Motley, they've got Trey Norwood, some guys that were really young that played in the secondary last season that really came on late as the season wore on. And so they might actually be pretty good there. They might be one of the best units in the Big 12 there. Up front, though, they do lose some guys. They lose DJ Ward. They lose Obo last year. They're NFL pass rusher. And I don't know, the guy they want to replace him with is Mark Jackson, I think. I don't know if he's going to be able to do the same kind of job that Obo did. And then the linebackers, they have Caleb Kelly and Kenneth Murray, who are both really good guys. They were a little bit inconsistent last year, though. So I don't know if they're necessarily going to have an elite defense this year, but they will be better in some places.
So Oklahoma always fixated on Texas, but it hasn't been much of a concern in recent years, although the Longhorns gave them quite a game in the Cotton Bowl this past season, 29-24. But Texas, considering what they were able to put together last season on defense, and I know that they lose a ton of talent, Malik Jefferson, Deshaun Elliott, Holton Hill, etc., on that side of the football. So those guys are going to have to be replaced. But it looks like the Texas defense is back to being something close to what the standard would be, and the offense has some decisions to make at quarterback in particular, although Sam Ehlinger appears to be the guy over Shane Buechele. But Texas, once again, a factor in the Big 12 after its first winning season in 5 years. So are Oklahoma fans once again thinking that with all that Texas talent at home, if Tom Herman's able to keep them at home, then once again, this becomes an elite rivalry?
Well, what's interesting is even though Texas hasn't necessarily been competitive on a national or even a Big 12 scale the past 2 years, that game has always been competitive. I don't know that OU fans are necessarily worried about that game this year. I think that they're maybe kind of taking more the approach that they'll believe it when they see it. And I think that's probably the feeling around the Big 12 overall when it comes to Texas, is that a lot of people see the potential. They see some of the talent there, and they see that things are getting turned around on defense. But it's still kind of wait and see for now. Let's see if Texas can really make that jump up to that next level.
So we've got Josh Cowan on the line from the LGG. They cover Big 12 athletics, and of course, football is front and center here at Mark Rogers TV. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel as we talk to the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry on a daily basis, and also analysis from myself. So we break it all down from schedules to rankings to positional group ratings and so forth. And Josh, we're not going to hold you to any kind of prediction here, but looking at the landscape of the Big 12, looking at the personnel losses and who's coming back, of course, we mentioned off the top that TCU replaces Kenny Hill with Sean Robinson at quarterback. Just give us a kind of a broad scope, broad brush look at the Big 12 and what you expect this season.
I think this season it's going to be really interesting. You have a lot of teams that I think could very well compete for the championship, and there are probably 6 or 7 of those teams, and there's not really a clear-cut favorite right now. You would think that would be OU, and last year there were positions, especially with quarterback, that you could point to and say that OU definitely has kind of the best player at that position in the conference. I don't know that they necessarily have that this year. And so like Oklahoma rightly should probably still be the favorite. But I don't know that they'll necessarily get to the championship unscathed. They might pick up 1 or 2 losses before they get to the Big 12 championship in Arlington.
Josh, I think we've seen where college football, in terms of the power structure, has been cyclical in recent years. Aside from the SEC always being either the best or at least having an argument, that's been maintained because of the talent structure in the South. But other than that, we saw where just a few years ago the Pac-12 was vying for the best conference in America, and maybe it's the worst now. The ACC's been there with the likes of Georgia Tech and Duke and other teams making it to ACC championship games, and Florida State and Clemson being the only two teams in town. But the ACC obviously has shown that they've improved considerably in the last couple of years, and the Big Ten has been down and now considered on the rise and up with a top half of the conference that's pretty formidable. The Big 12 took quite a hit a few years ago for losing big non-conference games, but rebounded well in the postseason a couple of years ago, and then carried that to a certain extent into last season as well. But the recruiting rankings in terms of the number of top 300 to 500 players coming into the conference seems to be dragging behind the competition. And then the NFL draft isn't necessarily a great indicator of talent in the Big 12. So based on what you see on the field, which is most important, so who cares what happens elsewhere? Those are indicators, but the results on the field are what matter. And we have such a small sample size because of the big non-conference games being so few and far between. You got to kind of hang your hat in conference comparisons on those big September games, and then also what happens in the postseason. And OU, despite a loss, acquitted itself against what's arguably the best team in the country last year in Georgia. Your thoughts about the Big 12 as it matches up in the Power Five?
We got a lot of interesting kind of non-conference games coming up. OU plays Florida Atlantic and Lane Kiffin, so that'll be really interesting. OU will probably be pretty heavily favored in most of their non-conference matchups, so the games might not be that interesting. Texas versus USC, that rematch will I think that in terms of a national stage, that'll probably have some implications. And in terms of like the Big 12 making an impression, if Texas wins that game, I think that will help the Big 12. Overall, this year there's some tough games for some Big 12 teams out there. Kansas State has to take on Mississippi State, and TCU has to take on Ohio State. And while TCU might be one of the better teams in the Big 12 this year, that's just that's a big ask to ask a team in September to take on the Buckeyes. But we'll see kind of how it plays out. I think long term, the Big 12, they're actually probably looking pretty good. Gary Patterson, Mike at TCU, Mike Gundy at OSU. I think that they probably have those programs headed in the right direction. It may not show up so much this year because both of those programs are retooling a lot. But I think in the long term, they're headed in the right direction. And you look at Texas and Oklahoma, they're probably headed in good directions as well.
Yeah, I believe those September games are fascinating in regards to comparing the conferences, but also taking it into context, because you mentioned TCU, Ohio State, for example. Uh, I just don't look at the results of the game and then say, oh, the Big 12 went 3-5 against the other Power 5 leagues in September, so they're not very good. You got to look at the matchups and the seedings of the teams. So TCU might be the best team in the Big 12, but they might turn out to be the third or fourth best team in the Big 12. We'll have to see how it plays out. Ohio State most likely is the best team in the Big 10. And then you got to take the narrative on the field and what we see, and not just the scoreboard. So if TCU gets blown out by 4 touchdowns, then that's completely different than them losing a field goal game. To me, that is. It's still 0-1 for the Big 12, but to me, those are showing two different qualities of football against a big-time opponent. As you mentioned, Oklahoma needs to hold serve against a UCLA team that's just getting its feet under them, most likely again with Chip Kelly in his first year. Oklahoma State has an interesting game with Boise State coming to town, and the Broncos appear to be the class of the group of 5, so they can't be taken lightly. And you mentioned Kansas State against a Mississippi State team that was ranked in the top 10 nationally in defense last year and is a bit of a dark horse selection from many people in the SEC. So, yes, a lot of intriguing matchups, and then we have to wait till postseason play to see how the conference shakes out. But we saw an Oklahoma team carried much by the win against Ohio State kind of reshaping the thought process concerning the Big 12, where the year prior they lose to Houston out of the gate and then get trampled by the Buckeyes, and therefore the Big 12 is seen as down right out of the gate because Oklahoma is the team that everybody looks to as carrying the banner. So it'll be interesting to see how the conferences fare against one another coming up this season. All right, we got Josh Cowan on the line from the LGG talking Oklahoma football. Is there anything we've missed, sir?
No, I think we pretty well covered everything.
Josh, we appreciate you coming on. Catch Josh and the rest of the staff at the LGG covering Big 12 football and athletics across the board. Josh, you have a great day.
All right, thanks. You too, Mark.